why is it so common for us in our community to grow up colorists? And where do we learn those things from? I feel like we should allow Black people and Black-ish people to go through a colorist phase without doing any work to prove that they don't still feel that way? Or is years past enough of the work? Welcome back, everyone. This is another episode of Grid of the Diaspora, and I'm your host, Nakira G. And today we are talking about colorism again. It seems like it's just constantly in the news, this time with Ari Lennox and Amaya Papaya. Let's talk about it. Okay, so first, let's get into Ari Lennox. So recently, Ari Lennox sent out a tweet, and she did kind of like a voice note thing, and she basically was talking about her frustrations when she watched Martin, the show, the 90s sitcom that everybody knows and loves or whatever. She basically just talks about how she's always felt about Pam's character, the way that colorism was always a part of her character, a part of the jokes that was said to her, particularly from Martin Lawrence's character. And I really didn't think that was a hot take, but I thought it was even more sad how many Black people are trying to rewrite history and say that there was no colorism on the show and that Martin never, said anything about Pam's skin complexion directly. And it made me realize that the younger generations as well as my generation really have a hard time with history as well as with critical thinking, because I don't think there's a world that any of us live in Black America where we did not understand that Martin had colorist language or had colorism between the actual characters. I think that it is literally night and day how Tisha Campbell's character was treated versus how Tashina Arnold's character was treated. I don't think that was a hot take. What is a hot take, though, is that people on social media was telling Ari Lennox that she needs to seek therapy and that she was overreacting and that her concept of colorism was incorrect in this particular moment, but actually it's not. I also saw some tweets that were saying, you can't use your 2025 awareness on 90s sitcoms. And respectfully, it's not really a 2025 awareness. I think that in the 90s, people were consciously aware of colorism. I think that people were less likely to speak out about it, people in the industry, because they were benefiting from those privileges on whichever side of the spectrum that they were on. But I think it's a bit ahistorical in its literal revisionist history to pretend like colorism was not present in Martin. And I saw that a lot of people were saying because Martin never explicitly spoke about Pam's skin complexion. But colorism is so many things. Colorism is not just the blatant verbiage or language or communication about somebody's skin complexion. It's all the other things surrounding skin complexion, right? All of the projections that go into what people think of dark-skinned people. The way that, for instance, if someone looks at me for 0.5 seconds and I'm not smiling, they will assume I am angry. They will assume I am mad at the world. They will assume that I'm getting ready to murder someone. They will assume literally the most negative things in the world from just looking at me for 0.3 seconds simply because of my skin complexion, right? However, white people are not told that 3 seconds that I was looking at you while you weren't smiling, you were just so aggressive looking and so unapproachable. They're not told that. Right? And so a part of colorism is also attributing all of these negative characteristics or stereotypes to someone's skin complexion. So calling someone aggressive, Saying that someone is overreacting is literally a form of colorism. It's also connected to why a lot of black women die in medical spaces, particularly when it comes to giving birth, because dark-skinned women are usually told that they are overreacting. And so the fact that social media users were telling Ari Lennox that she was overreacting to her analysis of Pam's character, I think that that's a reach, and I think that that in itself is a form of colorism, right? Because in any world where a dark-skinned woman, especially a woman who looks like Tashina Arnold's, right? If they say this is how I felt watching this show, if they say, damn, I look like Pam, my hair is like Pam's, my skin is like Pam's, and every time I watch this show, Martin is calling her a dog or an animal, that's not a hot take to say that that show has colorism, colorist language, and has colorism undertones. I do think that it's also funny too, because a lot of, just going back to the tweet that I mentioned where someone said you can't use 2025 awareness standards and put them onto 90s sitcoms or early 2000 sitcoms. And actually you can, because a lot of you complain about the fact that there are no black sitcoms today compared to like when I was growing up, right? Well, if we're being honest, a lot of those black sitcoms were misogynistic. There was colorism. There was there was classism, there was texturism, there was featureism. I mean, so many of our shows, as beautiful as they were, as fashion forward as they were, as representative as they were, at the end of the day, there were still things that needed to be tackled. And to be very fair, I can tell by the sitcoms today that they haven't been tackled. When you look at the show Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, any show, I would say all black sitcoms either did one of two things. They either showcase the reality of the times, they either reflect the times, or they challenge the times. Okay, so reflecting the times is simply when you're just talking about what's going on and what's it really like and being as honest about it as possible. But sometimes when people create things that challenge the times, they'll do things to make it clear that we're saying this is wrong, or this needs to change, or we're outgrowing this, or there's a generational shift. There's things that they will put in the writing that give you that idea. When you look at a show like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, right? The concept of colorism just ran rampant through that show, and nobody ever said anything, to the point where Aunt Viv's character was literally switched out. And again, it wasn't addressed. Nobody said anything, act like it wasn't a thing until recently. And even recently, Janet Hubert was the one who spoke about her experiences. And even when Will Smith apologized to her, he never really explicitly said colorism. He never explicitly said anti-blackness. He never explicitly said that he judged her. And when he did kind of say that he judged her, the concept of skin complexion and all those things weren't said. But you know what was said? Words like aggressive, words like I didn't understand her, even though they're both black, right? Words like I just didn't get it, I just didn't understand. Mind you, Janet Hubert on that show was the most decorated actress on that set. So even in a situation where you have somebody like a Will Smith saying, oh, I just didn't understand her, and I just didn't understand, and I was this young kid, and blah, blah, blah. What he didn't understand was why this dark-skinned ass woman had so much power and so much talent that he and his co-stars did not possess. That's what he didn't understand. Because I can guarantee you, if the personality that he said he did not understand of Janet Hubert, if what's our guy? If Uncle Phil had that behavior, I can guarantee you Will Smith would have never said, oh, I didn't understand him. Because men tend to understand each other, and they also tend to understand each other when they're light-skinned as well, but whatever, right? And so again, those are forms of colorism where Janet Hubert's skin complexion never has to be mentioned. But when you put certain characteristics or adjectives on their personality, like aggressive, or when you say things like, I don't understand, what do you as a black man don't understand of a black woman? Right? And so it's those types of things that I think that like we need to be a lot more careful when it comes to claiming that colorism was not explicit in these 90s and early 2000 sitcoms, because they were literally founded upon colorism. When you look at the show The Parkers was literally founded on fat phobia. Every comedic punchline had to do with weight, had to do with fatness, right? And it was always being spoken about 100% derogatorily, right? We watched a fat woman chase behind Professor Ogilvy the entire series of the show, right? And so I feel like it's so dishonest to say, oh, these shows, we can't look at them through our awareness eyes. Yes, we can. Especially those of you who want these shows back, or you want a show similar, or you want sequels to these shows. I personally don't want a sequel to any show if they're not going to address the things that could have potentially been harmful for a lot of us. You can literally type in Google colorism and black sitcoms, and there are literally hundreds of essays locked up in academic departments of people studying black sitcoms and colorism and misogyny and all of those things. So for people to sit there and say that Ari Lennox was overreacting, I think that they're just saying she's overreacting because they know that they have harbored a lot of that. I think a lot of people are saying that because deep down, a lot of people use those same jokes towards dark-skinned women. A lot of people have probably regurgitated jokes that they have heard Martin say to other people, and they don't want to accept that they've done that. So it's easier to just kind of say, oh, colorism doesn't exist, when we all know that it exists. I also want to say, someone made a comment and said that allegedly Tashina Arnold has come out and said that, you know, she never was harmed by the jokes that Martin had said, and she understood her job and she understood comedy, and that was never something that she felt like she internally had to grapple with. And to be fair, good for her. However, there were thousands of little dark-skinned girls who looked like Tashina Arnold, and every time that Martin called her a dog, unfortunately, it did affect some people. Now, I can say for me, didn't affect me. I don't have that type of parasocial relationship with television. And I also don't have like a super, like a hyper need to be represented on television in certain ways. But however, I did understand that whenever I watch Pam's character, I look more like Pam than I do Gina. I did understand that, oh, okay, that's why I've heard little black boys say these jokes, because they're reciting Martin. And so I think for everybody involved, even black women who play these roles, as well as these actresses, and they also then come out and say, oh, but I wasn't personally affected. Good for you, kudos. But however, those little black girls who heard Martin call you every animal in the kingdom, unfortunately, some of them internalized that. I don't think that's hard to believe. Moving right along. Let's get into Amaya Papaya. So some people pulled Amaya's past tweets, and it looks like she posted a list that basically said the differences between light-skinned girls, brown-skinned girls, and dark-skinned girls. So for those of y'all who don't know, Amaya Papaya is one of the cast members from Love Island, and she's also the winner of season 7 of Love Island or whatever. And so me personally, I don't have an obsession with calling everybody black. And I know that some of y'all do. Y'all want to call everybody black. I don't call everybody black, and I definitely don't call people black if they don't identify as black. Okay? If you are black and, I'm going to address you as black and, or whatever you are, Afro, whatever comes after your dash. But for me, I don't have a dash. Okay? So I'm just black, period, with a dot at the end. So I know when Amaya was on our screen, so many people was like, oh, is she Afro-Latino? Is she this? Is she that? And so many people were like, oh, she's black. She's black. And y'all do this thing where y'all think that everybody that identifies as Afro-Latino or Afro this, that, how that mix comes about is it can be in so many different ways, and how people are socialized to identify themselves. It's not gonna always just be Afro or Black or this or that. Also, unfortunately, South and Central America, the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, all of them, the level of y'all think that American colorism is hard to grasp. Once you get to Central and South America and the Caribbean, colorism is a part of life. It's a part of, hi, how are you? Right? And so a list came, or it looked like she posted this list that basically said like light-skinned girls are 65% thoughts, brown-skinned girls are 75% thoughts, dark-skinned girls are 100% thoughts, and then all these other like negative attributes to them. And it looks like she had different posts that was like, oh, this is what it looks like when a dark skin tries to talk to a light skin. Okay, so and so that's one layer to it. The second layer, though, is that people are claiming that, oh, she was 14 and 15 when she said this, and we shouldn't hold her to that standard. I'm going to say this, and then I'm just going to leave it alone. My thing is that I don't really understand why so many Black people have to go through a rite of passage of colorism. I really don't understand that. I think it's one thing when you have to go through like a rite of passage for certain things like adolescence to puberty, right? But I think it becomes a problem when you excuse literal 14, 13, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds for being violently colorist, right? And I think it also says something that so many people go through a colorist phase. Because my thing is that, well, how are you phasing out of that, right? How are you being educated into an adult? That's what really bothers me about a lot of this. Oh, that's a phase. At what point did we say, as Black Americans, as Black people, or whatever the case may be, that all of us went through this colorist, fat-phobic, homophobic rite of passage in our early teens and adolescence? I also think that it says a lot that it is very common for people, at least in my age range, who, when they were under 20 years old, I guess everybody was just on Twitter with seeing who could say the most colorist thing or the most racist thing possible. And that's a little alarming to me. It's a little alarming to me. And I think that it's one thing to say this person said this a long time ago. It's another thing to say, okay, but what does the work actually look like for me to believe that you don't still feel that way? And that's the problem that I have. I think that it's one thing to have had a past. Cool. We all have past. We all have things that we may not agree with today that we did before. However, just because she was on Love Island and just because she's a funny girl, I can't necessarily say I see anything that says she's not colorist. And I also can't base that off of her experience on Love Island because there weren't a lot of dark-skinned men on the show. And however, she also did not go for them. So I can't really sit up here and try to like cape for my girl because it's like, I don't know. However, I do want everybody who identifies as Black, everybody who identifies as Afro, everybody who identifies as, whatever, if you identify with some form of Blackness, I really want people to question, why is it so common for us in our community to grow up colorist? And where do we learn those things from? When it comes to the Central and South American and Caribbean folks, I understand where that comes from. It comes from birth. I understand that, right? But I'm just really curious for like Black folks in America. Why is that so common? And what are y'all teaching y'all kids that by the time they're 13 years old, they know how to make a negative joke about dark-skinned people? Because I can truthfully say, growing up in Los Angeles, growing up in public school, the first people that I heard made negative comments about skin complexion were little boys, were little Black boys from elementary school, middle school, high school. And even though it wasn't always said directly to me, a lot of times it was. A lot of times it was said to people around me, right? But I really question, what are y'all showing your kids or talking about, or what is happening in the household to where a 11-year-old little black boy knows how to tell a dark-skinned little girl that they're ugly? Like, those are the things that I want to interrogate more than, talking about, oh, it was a phase. Okay, well, it's a phase that's way too common in our community. So how does that look, right? Because everybody's not going to be as nice as other people. And colorism is getting, at least for me and for a lot of people, colorism is like coming back in style to where people think it's okay to like say things out loud or whatever the case may be. But I do want to say that this situation, like what we were talking about with the 90s and early 2000s black sitcoms, that is very connected to why a 14 and 15-year-old Amaya thinks it's okay to talk about dark-skinned people the way that she was, right? Because again, if you grew up watching shows like Martin, where calling dark-skinned women dogs and monkeys and animals amongst black people, I can also understand how a 7-year-old child, a 10-year-old child grew up watching that, thinking that that was funny until somebody punched them in the mouth, obviously, right? I can understand how that happens. So I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say in the comments. Let me know if you agree, if you disagree, if you grew up feeling like there were certain 90s or early 2000s sitcoms that you felt a way about, or if there were ones that you felt were really empowering. I feel like shows like Moesha was very empowering for me. I felt like shows like One on One was very empowering for me. And a bunch of other shows, honestly. But I do want to hear what you guys have to say, and if you guys felt like you agree with Ari Lennox or do you disagree. I also want to know how y'all feel about Amaya Papaya. Do y'all feel like we should allow black people and black-ish people to go through a colorist phase without doing any work to prove that they don't still feel that way? Or is years past enough of the work? Until next time.